Of the Executive Leadership Center. I'm so excited about our presenter today. He is a longtime friend of Franklin University, and as such, he has served in served as an adjunct, and we're just excited that he's here. When we can offer opportunities for our internal constituents to serve, we do so. And as you will notice in our scrolling this morning, we do have some upcoming events. Our pool session begins in March, and the pool session is the powerful, unmistakable legacy leaders, and that's when we celebrate Women's History Month. And so we're inviting each and every one of you to support as well. I will share with you that Dean has served as an HR director for 2 California cities, the governor of California in a JPA, and at the University of California. In addition to serving as a city library director, he has a doctorate from the University of the Pacific and an MPA from the University of Southern California, in addition to an MBA. Dean is also the author of 11 books, the last titled The Perfect Country, The Traits and Characteristics of a Good and Decent People, and has taught at universities throughout the world for over 20 years, including at the University of Massachusetts and the University of Arizona. And as I said, he has also been a longtime instructor here at the Franklin University. Dean enjoys writing, reading, and running, in addition to playing tennis and traveling. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and Dean will answer questions throughout our presentation. And then at the end, Jenny Cook, who is the coordinator for the Leadership Center, will come with further directives. Dean, we're in your hands. And thank you once again for joining in this capacity.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen. Everybody can see that, correct? It's coming up right now. We're good to go. Awesome. So this is the latest book that I wrote. I'm not here to sell a book. I'm really just here to talk about it. It's called The Perfect Country. And if you look at the picture of the book, it has 2 swaths of people and a person walking down the middle. I'm supposedly the person walking down the middle. So why did I write this book? By the way, it's meant to be an interactive discussion, more of a conversation than a presentation. If you have any questions, let me know. Be more than happy to chat with you about it. Back to the cover of the book. It's about how there seems to be 2 sides within our country, and the 2 sides really don't talk to each other anymore. This book is not political. Hopefully you would be pained to find out if I'm a Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal. That's not the intent at all. The intent really was, why can't people associate much anymore? Why is there less of a community and less of a society? And if that's really true, what can we do to bridge that gap? So I'm that person walking in the middle there, trying to figure out, well, how can people who may be different than me, think differently than me, behave differently than me, but how can we have these kind of conversations and interactions? As we all know, we're communal people. We like the interactions with others. There's much less of that today, and we're going to talk a bit more about that. But I'll give you a couple of interesting statistics. 25% of all restaurant sales are takeout. People really don't want to eat together as much as they have. In a recent poll, 90% of people wish that they could work at home versus the workplace. We actually don't want to work with people. And if you look at just about any civic or social organization today, they have lost membership. Some, like the Elks or the Moose Lodge, have lost about 50% of their membership. Even in our social aspects, people don't want to spend much time together. There's an interesting statistic that in the 1960s, virtually everybody was buried in a casket in a cemetery. We're moving towards, in the next decade or so, that only about 5 to 10% of people are going to be buried that way. They're going to be cremated. Not to be morbid, but kind of my joke is we don't even want to die together anymore. So it's that separation that I'm trying to figure out, how can we bridge that separation? I think I've come up with 5 strategies that will bridge that. Certainly, if you have a 6th or 7th, we'd love to hear from you. So we seem to argue more than debate, criticize more than praise, degrade more than dignify, generally speaking. Rarely do we talk to those people that we know, when we seldom socialize with people that we don't. When you look at statistics about people who know their neighbors, It used to be in the 70s, according to a New York Times report in 2000. And now we're in the 40s. So we spend less time with the neighbors. Some people don't even know their neighbors after 5 years of moving into a neighborhood. Amazing. We see one political party tends to denigrate another. If you're poor, you tend to not like the rich. If you're rich, you tend to not like the poor. Organizations, we hear at times, mistreat employees. Employees detest organizations. We're seeing that, at least in the latest polls and statistics, that employees feel less about their organizations than they did 10 and 20 years ago. It's hard for a day to go by that we don't hear about immigrants or citizens or illegals, if we even use those words anywhere. But it's not in the most positive of terms, and we really don't understand why it has to be that way. But it didn't used to be that way. We used to live and die in the same town. We worked with family. We had friends for a lifetime. We know that in the 1700s, about 90% of people lived in the same town and died in the same town. It was a very agrarian type of society where most people were in agriculture. In the 1980s, it went down to about 60%. Now, of course, it's around 1 to 2 to 3%. So it's a different world. When you were born in the same town, you didn't have the transportation opportunities that you have today. It's very difficult to move beyond, but there was a very strong sense of family and communal bonds. It doesn't exist as much. But back then, we used to be able to have our doors unlocked at night, walk neighborhoods safely. We conversed with strangers. If somebody broke down on a freeway, if you talked to your grandparents, often somebody would stop and see if they needed help. There's a great story one time about Nat King Cole's wife broke down on the freeway one time. You should look it up. It's a really interesting story about somebody who stopped and helped her. This, of course, was 50 years ago. We used to build community centers, join sporting teams, swim in local pools, play in parks. Most of that is gone. I worked in a city for many years, probably about 20 of my 25 years. And many of these community centers and sporting teams, even the library that I ran for about 5 years, continues to be a fading memory. We used to have 4th of July celebrations, attend street picnics, remember those? And we even helped friends paint their houses. Now, of course, we don't do that. We, as I mentioned earlier, don't really know our neighbors. By the way, this is not all doom and gloom. We're going to get to the positive stuff. Where have those days gone, though? As I started to think about society and communities and kind of harken back to where things were better. Again, anytime you go backwards, there are things that weren't as good, of course, but there was parts and there were parts that was good. That is something that should be replicated today. So how do we take the good parts of the way it used to be and try in some ways to replicate them today? One thing that I've learned is that we can't do everything, but we can do something. This book, in a way, is my attempt to do something, to offer something. Is it the panacea for everything that ills a community, our country? Absolutely not. We hope, though, that it starts a conversation that there are things that can be done. There's things that you and I can do that collectively may result in an even better community in which we live and a community in which we can leave to those who come after us. So when we look at previously and then we move forward to the future, I talked a bit about how we had the same people, same geographic areas, same occupation, same background, same family structure, even the same religions back then. It was same times. There was a lack of interaction because of technology, telecommunications, and transportation. I call those the 3 T's, which is what, when you look at what has changed society the most over the last 200 years, it has been technology, it has been telecommunication, and it has been transportation, globalization, the end result of those 3. I listed technology first because technology really has been the impetus for telecommunications and transportations. So we had similar times 100 and 200 years ago. We have very changing times today. The Industrial Revolution absolutely changed the family structure. We moved from farms into cities. The Industrial Revolution is what actually created the cities as we know them today. It created towns. Education came as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Most realize that our educational systems really weren't developed until the 1910s, where it became somewhat universal. It was the creation of governments. Governments really didn't levy taxes before the Industrial Revolution, certainly not the 20th century. Foreign relations, wealth distributions, professions, there really wasn't wealth distribution or inequities to those levels in the 1700s to the levels that we see them today, mainly because of the Industrial Revolution, which is one of the seminal epochs that we have seen. It's very similar to what we've seen with globalization today, how it completely and utterly has changed the very foundations of our world. So we have changing people today. We have some ancestors that were decent in some actions, but some were completely misguided. We have some histories that were enlightened in some thoughts and ignorant in others. And so now we have a chance to realize what did work and to promote that, and what didn't work to make sure that that's never seen again. So for me, I came up with 5 characteristics of a good and decent people. If we want to create a society that I believe offers the greatest promise to people and avoids the perils that maybe we've seen in some contexts and in some forums, I think there's 5 traits and characteristics. By the way, we're going to go through all of these very briefly in the next couple minutes. I think that there has to be some commonality, some compromise, and that's the one, by the way, that offers the greatest conversation, because compromise is not a word we like to use as much today. I think we all have to contribute. We have to be somewhat gracious and have a level of gratitude. So those are the 5: a sense of commonality, a sense of compromise. We have to contribute in some way and in some form. We have to be gracious people and have a sense of gratitude. If, in my supposition, in my theory, if we had those 5 attributes, we would create a better people, a better country. We'd at least move along the spectrum. So let's start with commonality. This is one that can be contentious if you hear the word commonality, because we're an uncommon people. And we should be grateful that we're uncommon, because as I often say, if you're driving down the street, you don't want to look at the same flower. You want to see different flowers. Part of the beauty of eating dinner is we don't eat the same meal every night. Part of the attraction of going shopping is that you can see different colors and formats and styles. So being uncommon is something that is really to be applauded, but there has to be some binding, some commonality that draws people to one another. I deliberately avoid some of the more controversial ones. 50 years ago, they wouldn't have been, but I'm not necessarily talking about that we all have to ascribe to the same religion or we have to have the same flag. I'm not even going as that far. I'm just saying that there has to be something somewhere that binds people together, where we can understand each other. When I went to college, I joined a fraternity. I know there's some people on the call that have been in a fraternity or sorority. If I was to meet anybody across the nation who was in the same fraternity as I would, we would have something in common. We would have something to talk about. That's a positive aspect. No matter what we feel about fraternities or sororities, it's a positive aspect. So I'm not saying everybody has to join a fraternity, but that's an example of where we have to have something similar, some similar ethics that we believe that this is right or this is wrong. We're not going to have many of those, I would imagine, and I would promote, but there has to be some that we believe that this is ethical conduct. And that goes with morals, principles, or beliefs. Whatever you want to call them, there has to be some basis that we as a people believe that this is really the right thing to do. And it could be as easy as we really should be honest and trustworthy people. We should work towards making sure that our word is our bond. My dad, if anybody was to see him in town, if he was to do business with anybody, they all know that his handshake is as good as his word. His word is as good as any type of paper. He's built a reputation over decades of interactions with people that they know if you're going to interact, have something in common with my dad, whose name is John, that you know that if he gives you your word, he'll keep it. That commonality is important. It allows us to have parallel lives, at least in some part of the way that we live. It connects one person to the next, one group to another, and one society to another. That commonality, that no matter I'm in California, no matter if I go to Oregon, our Ohio, our Florida, that we have that commonality, that we actually can have a conversation because we believe in similar aspects, not in totality, but there's some things that we believe in similarity. And it brings up Booker T. Washington, one of my favorite. There's a couple in here that I'm going to highlight, but there's much to learn from Booker T. Washington. Most people don't know that he's the first African-American to be honored on the U.S. postage stamp. He was born in 1856, of course, in the horrors of slavery, and he watched many of his people struggle for not only political, but economic and societal freedom. He believed individuals needed to have economic independence. It was the most important thing that you needed to have in order to have racial equality. He believed that that was the barometer, that was a commonality. He also believed, and this is why I'm a tremendous fan of his writings and his histories, he believed that education was a core tenet of that belief. He became, most people don't know, the founder of Tuskegee University. And the lessons that he learned, I put the story in here for a reason. He learned from a white person who befriended him. And that person was, according to Booker T. Washington, the noblest, rarest human being it has ever been my privilege to meet. And what he learned from his interaction with that person formed some of what Booker T. Washington became. That leads me to believe that we do have commonalities within us all, and we need to share and promote those commonalities. We have more commonalities, more similarities than dissimilarities, if we only so choose to look for it. Mr. Washington ended up writing more than 40 books, and he once wrote, "One man cannot hold another man down in the ditch without remaining down in the ditch with him." And I loved that quote because it's about this commonality that we hope to have with people. If you bring people up, you can have that commonality, but if you bring people down, you're going to have that commonality too. And so it's great lessons that we can learn from people. Booker showed us that life is always what you make it. I often say that it's not where you're born that matters, it's where you die that matters, which means it's what you do in your life that matters the most. It's not what base you were born on. Barry Switzer has a great line, is that some people are born on third base and they feel that it's all based on their merits. And in reality, they were just born in a lucky place. There's also people born on third base that never make it home. There's people born on first base that go round and round. So it's always what you do with what you have. That's what the point of this is. 2, compromise. People have the greatest issue or problem in this book with compromise. And I don't know why in some ways. Because if we believe in some level of commonality, then we should also believe that there's only certain things that we have in common, some things we don't have in common, and that's where we need to compromise. We don't always need to win. We need to win on things that are important. We should never feel like that fat. If it's important and it's central to who we are and where we want to go, then we do have to win. But if it's not, as we often say, a hill, if it's not a hill that we have to climb, then maybe we can compromise. And we have to think and believe with similar principles and actions, but we also have to understand that many of us have different ambitions throughout our lives. We have different perspectives on how we can interpret situations. And unless that perspective is fundamental to who you are and what you want to become, then maybe we should compromise. Maybe we should let other people be as they choose and not subscribe our principles on them on those things that don't matter. Again, if it's central to who we are and what we want to become, then you really can't compromise. But those should be so few in nature. We live in a country of freedom and liberty, which says that as long as you follow certain basic principles, pay your taxes, follow the laws, that you can do and be anything that you want. That means that most of what we know, we should compromise. In fact, if you look at commonality and compromise, we're really talking about just such few things, that there's such few things that we really should have in common. And there's such few things that we can't compromise on. And those are really important variables. And it brings up President Mikhail Gorbachev. I used a political figure here intentionally. And it's because President Gorbachev at one time was Time Magazine's President of the Decade. or person of the decade in the 1980s, over Ronald Reagan, who was seen as somewhat of a seminal figure, at least by some. But yet later he ran for president again, and he got just 1% of the vote. So isn't it interesting how one time you're lauded as this seminal figure in history, but just a few years later, you can only garner about 1% of the electoral votes for a position that you held a decade or two before. The true test of political courage, or courage in general, is to give up almost everything because we believe in something important. If you know anything about Mikhail Gorbachev, he was the president of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, and certainly one of the most dominant, along with the United States. He inherited a country with military superiority, but not much else. The economy was crashing and laws were unjust. He thought, what can we do to reinvigorate? What can we do to re-energize this country? He believed that the only way he can do it is tear it apart, was to allow many of the republics that were artificially attached to the Soviet Union, to allow them to create their own country. And that's what he did. He allowed many of these countries who were attached against their will to the Soviet Union, he allowed them to break away. And he did it without any type of revolution. Within 5 years of his presidency, the country that he was installed as president of, the Soviet Union, ceased to exist. He remade the political landscape, but it cost him his job. He believed that there was few things that we needed to have in common, but there was much that we needed to compromise on because there was only certain things that we really had to stand on. He believed the future of his country was based on people choosing their own path. And if he could do that, he could save his country, which is Russia, and he could create many other countries, which we often call the stands, like Kazakhstan. And as I said, because of his political will and courage, because of his willingness to compromise, he remade not only the political, but the economic and societal landscape, not just of his country and not just of his region, but of the world in general. Quite a man when you think back on it. Third is contribute. This is the easy one. This is the happy one, the contribution. The economy does benefit the many rather than the few. I gave a speech yesterday to the city of Modesto. I mentioned I live in California. It was at their leadership conference. And we were talking about economic mobility. And I often ask the question is, if you look at those who have made it in their life, who have been successful millionaires, I often ask, what percent of those people made it on their own? And you hear things like 1%, 5%, meaning that the economy is against the great majority of people. The answer is upwards of 80%. 80 people who have made it today made it on their own. It's a surprising statistic when you think about it. Most people think that they inherit their wealth, they inherit their position, they inherit their social status. That's not true. This country still today has a great deal of economic mobility, if you so choose to take it. If you look at the box to the right, it says all you have to do is you have to have a chance to make it. And if you have a chance to make it, then of course you have to dream for it, save for it, risk for it, and work for it. If you were to see in front of me on my desk, there's a sign that says, work hard, be kind, and never give up. That's what my parents taught us. The first thing is work hard. You have to work hard. You have to, if you choose to make it, then you have to dream for it, which means you have to have this vision of where you want to go. You have to save for it, because that takes a great deal of will. It takes sacrifice. And then you have to take a risk. We just had the Super Bowl, and you can see at the end of the Super Bowl, both before and after overtime, one team took a greater risk than the other. Doesn't always work out. If it did, everybody would take a risk. But you usually have to give something up to take a risk. And that risk is loss. You have the potential for loss. But someone took the risk, and in this case, it won. And then you have to work for it. And we talked about work for it. I think it was one of the great tenors, singing tenors, who said, dreams don't last. Something needs to be done about them. I think that was Beverly, I forget her last name, but I'm sure somebody, one of the great singers. don't want to wait too much. The last name is escaping me. I think she was the one that said dreams don't keep. Something needs to be done about them. To be a contributor, we have to produce more than we consume, and we have to pay more than you cost. You have to leave something behind. I often talk about, the meaning of life is that you did the best you could with what you had. That you, in some way, you made something better through your time here on earth. And that's what contribution. If everybody contributes something, anything, can you imagine in totality what it can do for a society? So we started with having some commonality. We obviously talked about having compromise, and we're at contribution. Just two more, but before we do, I want to talk about Betty Davis. This slide is a bit interesting because some people say Betty Davis, for those who remember her, she was a very famous actress, maybe one of the greatest, if not the greatest actress of her time. At one time, she had all of the records, the most Academy Awards, the most nominations. That has since been overtaken. But she still has the third most Best Actress nominations in history. First, to win 2 Best Actor Academy Awards. She had talent, drive, of course, and dedication, but it wasn't an easy path for Betty Davis. Her father used to tell her how unimportant she was, which paralyzed most people, but it didn't her. She believed that she could conquer the world, as she later wrote in her 2 autobiographies. I often say she's so famous that she had to write 2 autobiographies. Until her dying breath, Betty Davis learned, worked, prevailed, contributed, and conquered. She studied her craft, which is acting. At one time, she battled powerful studio bosses like Jack Warner. She wanted better parts, but he did not want to give her a better part, so she went to England. She broke her contract. He sued her, and he said, no, you have to come back and you have to fulfill your contract. Sadly, she lost, but she later said, I'm a woman. I was told I had no right to fight like a man, but she did. Even though she lost, she changed the system that existed at the time. She stood her ground. Those who came after her should be grateful that she, yes, contributed. And she didn't build a park or build a building or run for office and become a senator. She did her part. She did her contribution by fighting within her industry to make that better. So you can see, no matter what your profession is, what your position is, you do have a chance to make a difference, to make a contribution, if you so choose to take that chance. It reminds me of what she has on her tombstone. It says, she did it the hard way. And Betty Davis did. She did it the hard way. Thankfully, she did for those people who are in this industry because she's made it better for them. 4, now we get to the lighthearted ones, the easiest ones we often think, to be gracious. I think in some ways it's even more hard because if I was to generalize, I would say we probably have a few less gracious people today than maybe we did some years ago. A gracious person is somebody who's kind and courteous. As I mentioned about my parents saying, work hard, be kind, and never give up. It's because if you're kind, you get a lot of do-overs in life. I was an HR director, as Dr. Bowen said, and I've often said that if you're kind and a person who is friendly, that not only do you get a lot of do-overs, but you get a lot of excuses, which means, oh, it's okay about Betty. She's just such a nice person. I'm sure she didn't do it on purpose. Oh, it's okay about Joe. He's so nice. He probably just overlooked that. If you're not a gracious person, if you're not a kind person, if you're not a friendly person, you don't get as many do-overs as if you're a gracious person. And don't we all want to live in a place where there's gracious people, where decent and honorable people pursue noble and just ambitions? If you're a good and decent person, you're going to pursue noble and just ambitions. The goodness that is within you is going to be directed towards noble pursuits, to make something better, to make someone better. And graciousness, it really is one of those attributes that I try to emulate in everything that I do. I think there's no better appetite or title for somebody that they're a very kind person. They're just kind. I think in some sectors of our world, we think that if you're kind, you're seen as somewhat as a pushover or maybe not aggressive. And that's far from the point. In fact, you'll see that kind people, generous people, can often get more in return just by the way they carry themselves. They attract people to them. And that's part of being a leader, isn't it? To attract people to you. Because when people are attracted to you, you can work with those people to do something greater than what you can do yourself.
I have a quick question about the impact of mental health on being gracious. Like sometimes, if a person is super stressed out, it's hard to be gracious because you're focusing on, I don't know, a medical problem or homelessness or, whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I would tell you, that's not my specialty, mental health. So I'm sure there's people on the call that are much greater experts at it in terms of mental health. You certainly have to be a very sound mind and body to be a gracious person, I would think, because and you have to be what I would call a more enlightened person. There's so many more negative influences in our lives than positive. And if you have a very positive self-image of course, of yourself, but of others, you tend to be a more kind and generous person, in my view. A person who is, I was talking yesterday about people who may be jealous, are greedy, are envious. Those are people who would not be gracious, kind, generous, and friendly because they have what we often call they have human emotions that prevent them from thinking rationally and reasonably. So I think if there's if you have a mental challenge of one or another, I think it may preclude you in some parts from being a gracious person because you would not be able to think clearly and rationally in all situations. It is not my expertise, but that's what I think. The more I like the word enlightened, the more enlightened philosophical person, and that usually comes with educations, both formal and informal. Those are the people that move along the spectrum to become, they use their enlightenment to think better of other people, even than they think of themselves. To get to that stage takes quite a bit of time, and it takes a lot of study and analysis, both within yourself and reading. But you can become that type of person. A person, like I say, when I wrote a book called The Meaning of Life, and I concluded, as I mentioned just a bit ago, that to have meaning in your life, that you do have to do the best with what you have, with what you can, and that you have to believe that you really can make a positive difference. It takes some time to get to that point. I hope I answered that question. I would just say it's not necessarily my expertise, but I think it is along the continuum. You have to move to where you feel better about yourself, feel better about other people. If you're jealous and envious of other people, it's almost impossible to be a kind and generous person. And so you have to have that very positive image and self-image of yourself and others in order to be that type of person. I think there's a couple of people here I'm going to highlight that I think are gracious. Obviously, Grace Kelly, it's part of her name. And I've been to Monaco many times. I think it's a great country. She had a great work ethic. She won an Academy Award, but most importantly, her life really was dedicated to the Red Cross. She was a mythical person, and it's very difficult. And that myth was perpetuated by about 20 to 30 years where she never made a misstep, never made a statement, if you go back, that was less than absolutely kind and generous to every person that she met. And she was a very serene person. That's why she was known as Her Serene Highness. But when people talk about her, there was a serenity that came from her. She was a great role model, as was Willie Whitelaw. Most people don't know him. Some years ago, I had the chance to meet Margaret Thatcher, who was one of my heroes by the way that she led her life. Very controversial figure, though. And her deputy through much of her tenure as the Prime Minister of Great Britain, she was the first woman ever elected in history to that office in the Western world. Very seminal achievement. Most of us don't know what it was like to be a woman during her time. She was when she was elected to Congress, their Congress, which is called Parliament, She was 6 out of about 500. She was one of 6 women. They didn't even have a woman's restroom during that time. But her deputy was William Whitelaw, and he was born into nobility, but he really believed in this thing about public service. And when he died, I think the mark of a person is what your opponents say about you. And Prime Minister Blair, who was an opponent of his, said he was a genuinely decent man. And I think that that's a great moniker to put on somebody. He said, you know, a generally nice guy. He's known even today as somebody who was very helpful of the person that he served. He was deputy prime minister, the prime minister. And I look at him, I've read his autobiography, I look at him as somebody that I want to emulate. As with Sidney Poitier, very poor person, raised in the Bahamas. Most people don't know that he was shot in the leg in a race riot, but he kept going. He was the first African-American to win an Academy Award as Best Actor, and he broke many barriers down during his life. But when you look back, and I encourage you to look back on somebody like Grace Kelly and Sidney Poitier, they're often talked about how graceful and kind and generous they were to other people. And I raise this as one of the 5 because I just keep thinking if more and more of us were of this type of person, was like a Sidney Poitier, was like a Willie Whitelaw, if we can learn to be even more generous to people than they are of us, can you imagine the type of world that we would create? And it brings us to, yes, the last one, which is gratitude. I do believe no one gets it all, but others get something. You always have something. You have something that no one else has. The real trick in life is to do something with what you have. If you were to see in front of my desk, there's another sign that says you have to play the cards you're dealt. We don't get everything, but everybody gets something. And I believe that that something can make you a somebody. And we should be very grateful for what we have. I have a saying here in the bottom right that says, be grateful for what you have, not ungrateful for what you don't have. And then do something with it. And that's the thing that I learned from Lee Iacocca, who wrote a book. And he said that his parents taught him everything that you could about ethics and morals. And they sent him to a great school. And at the end of his schooling, they actually talked to him and said, now go do something with it. So just don't sit on your laurels, sit on your accomplishment, sit on your awards, do something with it. Be grateful for what you do have, but don't be ungrateful for what you don't have. I used to remember, I'll tell you a quick story. I used to remember John F. Kennedy Jr. And when he was younger, I was younger. And I used to think, gosh, to be John F. Kennedy Jr., he can go out with, he was dating Daryl Hannah at the time, if anybody remembers her. And I used to think she was just great. And I thought, wow, you know, this guy, he's so famous and he looks like that and he has Daryl Hannah. I wish I could be John F. Kennedy Jr. Lo and behold, some years later, he was in an unhappy marriage, and then he ended up dying, I think, at 39. And it reminds me, you know, be careful what you wish for, because if had I been John F. Kennedy, I would have died at a young age. I wouldn't have had kids, and I have 2 great kids. And so it's a great lesson on being grateful for what you have. I think as a society, if we were more grateful for all of the good fortune in our lives, and I believe all of us have good fortune if we only so choose to look for it. And it reminds me of Alice Milliot. Most people don't know who she is, but I think when I tell a story, maybe you will. She changed the scope of sports. She felt that it is incomprehensible that women were excluded from the Olympic Games. So in 1919, what did she do? She started her own. She started her own group so that women can compete. Well, the Olympic Committee sued her and forced her to change the name of the group that she created. She did, yet the organization that she created became a success. So the Olympics capitulated, and they welcomed women to the games based on what Alice Milliot did. And that's how women entered the Olympics in the early 19th century. And that's why in 2021, the French Olympics unveiled a statue of her at their headquarters. She said at one time, as we have no vote, we cannot make our needs publicly felt or bring pressure to bear in the right quarters. So although she didn't have a vote, she could do something. She was grateful in so many ways. She was gracious in so many other ways. And she pursued not in anger or spite. She created something on her own so that she could help people. You don't have to have an office or a position to do that. And you don't have to do that negatively. You can still do it positively. And when the time came to allow women into the Olympics, and it sounds weird to even say that, right? To allow women into Olympics. But when it came time, she welcomed the change. And she was so graceful and had such gratitude for joining that almost 80 years later, they named their headquarters after her. Quite an accomplishment. So we hope to do something better. We want to share common values, some. We want to compromise our individual gains for collective benefits, some. And we have to contribute our unique talents and skills to better this place. We have to extend grace and kindness to everybody within our path. And we do have to be grateful for the good fortune that we've been given. And I will make one other point about respect, and that is we have to acknowledge that there are different views that exist. And then we have to seek to understand these different views and where they exist in an unbiased and comprehensive manner, and make the necessary steps to find some common ground. Common ground, not on everything, but on some things. We have to have an ability to respect those whose views may not be seen, even as well-founded or well-grounded or well-reasoned. There are people out there who have a view that defies logic of any measure. But we believe in the freedom of expression and religion and a host of other rights. And so it's the price that we have to pay to live in a free society. And it is a welcome price because we get so much more on one side than we do on the other. I'll end with this quote, which says that I did my best, now you do better. And I tell my kids this all the time. They're in their early 20s. And sometimes you hear, oh, I wish you would have done this or that. And I always say, I've done my best, now you do better. And same here as I end this discussion, which is, this is my supposition and proposition about what we can do to make society just a little bit better. Are all the answers here? Obviously not. Are there some that I left out? Probably. And so hopefully you can come up with some in your own life and say, you know, I like 2 or 3 of these, but I'm going to add this one. And then you can do something to make your community better, which may make your society better, which may, just may, make society better, or the country better. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. And I'll stop sharing. Feel free to ask anything at all.
Thank you, Dean. That was very enlightening. I really appreciated it, and we appreciate having you here. We also want to thank everybody else for coming out today. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat if you don't want to ask out loud, but if not, I think you can all unmute yourselves if you would like to ask a question.
I'll make a comment. Aaron made a comment about, and it's about a library, which I used to run for 5 years, which is kind of interesting. I mentioned yesterday, I was talking to a city, and somebody asked a question about what do you do when somebody is unreasonable, has a view that defies all logic. In some ways, the easy answer is you have to walk away. We can't reason with somebody who's unreasonable, and I think sometimes we try. But if I call it the blue sky, green sky. If I was to walk out, obviously the sky is blue. If the person next to me says it's not blue, it's green, you have no chance. You're fighting a losing battle. You hope that you can have a conversation with somebody who at least listens to some reason or logic. But if they don't, it's going to be very difficult for you to have any type of commonality with that type of person. The other thing that I'll say that I hear quite a bit when I talk about this book or give this speech is we're in a society where we judge in totality, which means if you like one thing about, if you mention something about somebody, they assume that you like everything. And I don't think that that has to be. I think we have to move from, if you like something about this political figure, it doesn't mean that you like everything that they've ever said or done. If you like something about the other political figure, it doesn't mean you just got subscribed to everything that they've done. There's a great saying that goes back that we borrowed rice from the Chinese, but we don't eat with chopsticks, which means we like rice and we're going to take the rice, but we don't like eating with chopsticks, so we're not going to do that. And that's a great parable, I guess, about how we take what we like, but what we don't like, we don't have to take. So instead of, in some ways today, we would say, no, I don't like chopsticks, so I'm not going to eat rice. And there's some that would do that. Now, maybe we have to say, I don't like what you said over here, but I do like what you said over here. Let's go have lunch. And I think that's what we're trying to get to. And I hope my 5 traits and characteristics I came up with help us get there, that we're not going to like everything about the person in this chat. There's many of you who are not going to like everything about my presentation, but hopefully there's something in here that you like, that you can walk away and say, I really like that. I don't agree with them on that. I'm thinking about it and it gives me pause for thought, but I do like what they said over here. So I'm going to take that. I think that's what we're trying to get to, is that there's some things of value in every person that we meet and see. Take that, and then just don't take that other aspect.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, a lot of people on the call are, in a leadership role or striving to be that great leader. And you can take some of these characteristics and traits and apply them, and like you said,
Yeah.
don't have to take them all, but you could take 1 or 2 of them and do something great with them.
Right, right. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, Jen.
Yes, thank you. And just so everybody knows, we do have we have our March pool series coming up, and I'm going to share the slide again just so you guys can see. It is every Tuesday in March. It's at 11 o'clock, the same time frame. And we, let me pull up my screen here so I can share that with you. There we go. And pool stands for Powerful, Unmistakable Legacy Leaders. And it's in our empowerment series. And it just focuses on extraordinary women in their leadership. It is not just for women; men can come too. So please feel free to join if you want to. And the first session is actually on March 5th. And it is with Stephanie Ravish, and she is the Vice President of Finance at Target Corporation. You can scan the QR code and go directly to the registration for her, or you can just visit our website, and I can put that in the chat as well. And it will have all the information of all of the upcoming pool sessions. So I want to